What's the difference between a glute bridge and a hip thrust?
So honestly, I saw these as kind of interchangeable up until about a couple years ago, where I thought a glute bridge was just from the floor and a hip thrust was from a bench. But it's actually more about the range of motion and execution of the exercise.
It's the intention going into it.
Absolutely. So with a glute bridge, you're going to have probably a third to maybe half the range of motion that you have in a hip thrust. And you can do both of them from a bench or from the floor. The difference is the range of motion, number one, like we just said, and the execution. So with the range of motion in the hip thrust, you're probably going to bring the bar all the way until the plates hit the floor, and then you'll thrust back up more explosively. Whereas in a glute bridge, you're going to come down a little bit lower, and you're going to focus mostly on controlling the eccentric, the positive motion. In a glute bridge, you're going to focus a little bit more on controlling the eccentric and concentric part of the movement, so the lowering and the thrust, right, or the bridge. So it'll probably be maybe a couple seconds on the way down, and then 1 to 2 seconds on the way up, and you're holding the squeeze for maybe half a second to a second. Versus a hip thrust, you're more focused on being explosive from the bottom position, which generally is starting from a dead stop or starting on the floor. And you might not hold that squeeze at the top. Sometimes you might, other times you don't. But with the hip thrust, you're probably, because it's more explosive in nature, it's going to have a little bit more carryover to your other lifts like a squat or a deadlift, versus a glute bridge will get you a little bit more as it relates like building your glutes. So like a glute bridge is probably better for someone who's maybe a physique competitor or just wants to focus on growing their glutes, and it'll still have some carryover to the main lifts, but not as much as a hip thrust. And so like the hip thrust would be one where if you're mostly focused on strength and performance, then that one would be better for that. But you'll still build your glutes up from hip thrusts, but you'll have that more carryover to the other lifts. So I think hip thrusts tend to be better and more performance and strength type programs, and a glute bridge tends to be better for more aesthetics focused programs. And if you have kind of a blend of the two, like how Zach and I like to train, more like power building, then you would probably want to go for a hip thrust, and maybe you have glute bridges on one day and hip thrusts on another. I think if you're gonna pick one in a performance-based program, or even like a hybrid of strength and physique, you'd probably want to go with a hip thrust or both. And if you're more physique focused, if you had to pick one, you'd want to do a glute bridge, but it'd probably be a good idea to do both, because if that's going to help your squat and your deadlift as well, and you're probably doing those if you're more focused on your physique anyway, that has a lot of carryover.
And that's how I use it. So I know I've brought it up on the podcast before, but I would train hockey players right after I graduated college, and we would actually start them off in their warm-up doing glute bridges, kind of getting that full range of motion, gaining that mind-muscle connection, just kind of activating the glutes. And then during their training, it was more of a hip thrust where we were focused strictly on force output. So the glute bridge acted as more of like a warm-up glute activation, and then the hip thrust was where we wanted to see the improvements. So, and I know you mentioned it, and I know you know this too, but even throwing in a hip thrust for aesthetics will be beneficial if it's something you haven't done, especially recently. So we always preach, if you have an aesthetic goal, to focus on performance, and the aesthetics will come. It's more of one of those like fine-tuning things where if you really want to maximize your aesthetics, then yes, focusing on a glute bridge will promote a little bit more of that muscle building signal, as opposed to just like that force output that you get with a hip thrust.
Yeah. And I've also found that a glute bridge can be a great teaching tool before someone gets to a hip thrust. So if someone's newer to training, and I have a client who's just beginning, a glute bridge might be better to kind of get that mind muscle connection to the glutes before they start doing a thrust, because if you don't have the right setup and you don't know how to put yourself in a position to target your glutes, once you go into hip thrusts, depending on your setup, you could get too much quads, you get too much hamstring. So it kind of helps you find the setup and then find the right kind of like places on your feet where you're trying to drive. So like I like to think of a tripod foot, like your heel, your pinky toe, the pad of your pinky toe, and the pad of your big toe. And you drive through those 3 spots. And I also kind of think about corkscrewing my feet into the ground. So driving them down and slightly like rotating outward. And the feet aren't actually rotating, but you have that thought going into it. And I found that really helps you connect with the glutes. And when you do that in a glute bridge for a little while, then you can be a lot more, like you're still being explosive in a hip thrust, but you can actually still be explosive, but with your glutes. And really focusing on using your hips to your glutes to extend the hips in a hip thrust, so it ends up having more carryover because you can do it correctly.
Well, and that's one thing I noticed with my training. And I'm going to use squatting as an example. When I was taught how to squat, there was no controlling the eccentric. It was just you get down into the hole as fast as possible and you explode up, because I was training for football and we needed that explosiveness. But because I didn't learn that control on the way down, it was harder for me to do a body weight squat than it was for me to throw 225 on the bar and have the bar pull me down. That led into a lot of issues down the road when I started focusing more on that mind muscle connection. And I had to take about 5 steps back to be able to take 10 steps forward, because I needed to learn that control. So for a beginner, it would be much more advantageous to start with a glute bridge and then work your way into a hip thrust, because you're learning that control and you know what you're connecting to, as opposed to just going through the motion of it. And that's where the intention comes in, because it's monkey see, monkey do. Like I've seen people copy my workouts in the gym, but the intention isn't there, and then they wonder why they don't get the results that they're looking for, because there's no intention behind what they're doing. They're just doing it because that's what they think they need to be doing.
Yeah, and they're probably also forgetting to copy that you do a 1 rep max every fucking workout. So
yeah, that's a different story though.
Yeah. How long has it been since you've hit a 1 rep max on a lift?
Probably a month.
Good. It's
at
about
least.
fucking time.
Yeah, no, it's
And before that, it was at least once a week.
at least once a week.
Yeah.
I mean, I was taking, and it was probably more like once a week, but I was taking different movements once a week
Yeah.
to failure. But like right now I'm doing,
But you were going like 1 rep max
yes.
on each lift, like cycling through.
Actually, I take that back. It's been probably about 3 weeks.
Okay.
Because I tried a 1 rep max back squat the other day.
After your disc too?
Yeah, I actually tried that
Fucking A,
twice
dude.
after my disc.
You're something else, man.
Yeah, do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say to that right now.
Question 2.
Yep.